Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I can't imagine a better place to have a sublime conversation than in this extraordinary room at the Morgan Library. It's really quite amazing. And where better to have a conversation about some of the deepest questions we might ask, like what does it mean to experience God? So there are a lot of ways to understand religion. There are theologians who study scripture, psychologists who look at the nature of belief, atheists who just as soon dump every scrap of religion into the Hudson River. And then there's Tanya Luhrmann, who is one of the most thoughtful and perceptive thinkers about religion I know of. She studies spiritual experience, how people actually practice religion, and she asks really interesting questions. What do people mean when they talk to God? And maybe more surprisingly, when God talks back, to cite the title of one of her books. How do you distinguish between an ecstatic religious experience and a psychotic experience? Tanya is an anthropologist at Stanford, where she's done groundbreaking ethnographic studies of religion and also remarkable cross-cultural studies on schizophrenia. We'll get into all of this. I first met Tanya nearly 10 years ago at a symposium at the Esalen Institute in California, which was about the role of imagination in extraordinary spiritual experiences. And what immediately struck me was how she brought so much of herself into her work. She's someone who lives what she studies, which has led to some interesting encounters, including one time when she looked out the window and saw 6 magical druids looking at her, which maybe we'll hear more about during this conversation. Some years ago, she embedded herself in a charismatic evangelical church where she prayed with members of the congregation, talked with women who went on regular date nights with Jesus. Tanya studies intense and intimate spiritual experiences, hearing the voice of God, feeling the presence of the dead, being possessed by demonic spirits. Those experiences where the membrane between the mind and the outer world gets very thin, or as she says, porous. This is totally fascinating work, and we have a lot to talk about, so without further ado, welcome, Tanya.
Thank you very much. Is this mic well placed for you? Okay.
It is, yeah. So why don't we start at the beginning? When did you first realize that you wanted to study religion?
That's a very good question. I grew up as the daughter of a mom whose dad was a Baptist pastor, and my mother died surrounded by books by Sam Harris, but never stopped going to church. I am also the daughter of a father who grew up Christian Scientist. And as you may know, Christian Science is a faith in which you're not supposed to use medical help. Well, my father went to medical school. And I grew up, and we lived in an Orthodox Jewish community, on the edge of that community as a Shabbos Goy. So as you know, Orthodox Jews between sundown on Friday and sundown on Saturday don't work, don't turn on and off electric switches, don't use money. And so I would sometimes go over to a friend's house and turn on the lights and turn on the disposal. And I could tell that this sort of made my mother anxious, even though she didn't really believe in God, but so why? And so I just knew these good, wise people who had very different understandings of what was ultimately real. And so the question of what that was about has been with me as long as I can remember.
So skipping ahead, I know in grad school you went to Cambridge University, right? Mm-hmm. And you somehow ended up hanging out with a bunch of druids and witches.
I did. So there's a famous book in anthropology by Evans Pritchard called Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. And his question was, how can reasonable people, in this case, non-literate people in sub-Saharan Africa, how can apparently reasonable people believe in magic? Which is an apparently unreasonable thing to believe in. And I thought it would be interesting to ask the same question of people in London. So people who were clearly literate, clearly well-trained in science, but who had chosen to practice what they called magic. So these were people who would meet in, people like you, who joined small secretive societies And they more or less all had the idea that there was this power, something kind of invisible, something ethereal, something electrical, something supernatural. And there are different kinds of groups. There was the Witchcraft Coven, there was the Initiates of the Western Mysteries, there was a Kabbalistic group. They all had the idea that you could sort of, in a group, you could sort of learn to manage this force and pull it in and direct it in a particular way. And I wanted to know how that worked, how you came in, particularly in London. These were not people who grew up in this kind of society. They came in, they ran across an ad, they went in, the Atlantis bookstore was a place where a lot of this stuff seemed to happen. They would come into this bookstore, this metaphysical bookstore, they'd see an ad, they'd join a group, and then they decided that the magic worked. And I wanted to understand how that happened.
So you had to kind of join some of these groups, right? And you had to practice magic.
So we anthropologists more or less go native. I'm not sure that's the phrase people would use these days, but we, to the extent that we can, and me maybe a little bit more than some of my colleagues, we come to a world we want to understand, and we really want to live inside that world and understand what it would take to be a member of that world. And what really struck me about these different magical societies is that people were really clear that some people are naturally better at magic than other people, but if you want to but what's really going to introduce you to magic is learning how to do it. And if you don't learn how to do it, you're not going to understand. And so I went into these groups. So I had this idea. It's just the early days of cognitive science. I kind of had in my mind that kind of the idea that I was going to be studying narrative and heuristics. I was going to find this group of people who had a culture, and I was going to understand the concepts and the metaphors and the narrative lines they used in that unique culture to make sense of everyday experience. And that would help me to understand how you could go from not thinking that magic worked to thinking that magic worked. And there was plenty of those cognitive ideas. What I learned, or what stunned me, was that to do magic meant to get training. It meant to take classes. It meant to do a home study course. It meant to go to a Monday evening event called Pagan Pathfinders, where we did exercises, much as you might do yoga exercises.
Wait, so what did you do? What does it mean to do magic?
Well, so what mostly they did, and it's going to sound like the nation's spiritual exercises. It might sound like Sufi practices. It might sound like Kabbalistic exercises. We would sit together in a room, and everybody would shut their eyes. And somebody would tell a story. And the story was they would call this a pathworking, but basically it was a story about some kind of journey. So you would start, and in your mind's eye, you would maybe get into a boat and float down the river, or I did an exercise 15 minutes a day for months in which I would shut my eyes. This was my exercise, not the real thing, but the exercise. I would be in my room, I'd shut my eyes, and in my mind I would go up into the sky into a garden. And then I had this garden, and I had to plant this garden. I had to find an altar. I had to find a chalice. I had to find seeds. I had to plant those seeds. I had to surround the altar with a bed of flowers. I had to find a dagger, an athame, a magical knife. When we would do the pathworkings, I remember one of the pathworkings that moved me was when we were led. There was a group of us in Pagan Pathfinders, and this woman was leading the exercise. We all have our eyes shut, the light is off. And she's telling a story about a lion-headed goddess called Sekhmet, from an Egyptian provenance. And she told us, and she felt she wasn't tough enough. She wasn't, she felt she was kind of weak. She wanted what Sekhmet had. And so she created for us a pit of fire in our mind's eye. And we sort of talked about Sekhmet, and then she had each of us walk across the bridge. There was a bridge over the pit of fire until we came near to Sekhmet. And then Sekhmet gave us something, which we installed somewhere in our body. And then we walked back. And when we did these practices, the explicit instruction was to use all your mind's inner senses, to feel the fire, to feel the heat of the fire, to see the red-orange of the flames, to look at the face of Sekhmet, to see her sort of lion's nose, to kind of to hear the fire, to hear the bird song, when I was going up to my garden, I was trying to listen to the birds. I was trying to feel the clouds. I was trying to do all that I could with my inner senses in order to have that experience come to life.
But I thought magic was about casting spells,
Sure.
making things happen in the world that wouldn't ordinarily. I mean, because what you're talking about is sort of more of an act of imagination, almost a meditative practice. But magic takes it much further, right? It actually you're making stuff happen in the world.
Well, I mean, so the idea was that you use these stories, you use these vivid experiences, and the theological idea, to call it that, was that somehow the more vividly you imagined, somehow the stuff, depending on your group, some groups had stuff out there and some groups were generating stuff in here, but you sort of, the vividness would somehow collect and concentrate, and then you could direct. So in a witchcraft coven, there was one event, I think we were trying to get somebody the house next door. So people had some loftier goals and less lofty goals. One of the more lofty goals was bringing truth into British politics. So we were trying to get the house next door. And so, and so you have a group of people, I've got nine people in the room. And there's the people, they draw a magic circle on the ground, and we're inside the magic circle. And the idea, and we have a goddess, and we have a god, and we have fire, and we have symbols, and it's dark, and it's very evocative. And we're going to do this ritual. The idea is we hold hands. I think we shut our eyes, sort of. You have to make sure you don't fall over. Anyway, so you're holding hands. You start spinning together as a circle, spinning round, and you start chanting, "Iko, Iko, Azarak." This is all published. But you start chanting something, and you're moving more and more quickly, and you're trying to, as you're doing that, you're really focusing on something. In this case, the house next door. What does that look like? And sometimes people bring pictures, so you can see the picture. And you're trying to, in your mind's eye, you've got some activity. The idea is that you were kind of getting the force. The force, you're generating it, is coming from outside, it's being concentrated in this spinning top. And at a certain moment, you stop. And somehow that force is going out through this image that you have in your mind toward some end. And this sticks with me because, in fact, what happened is that a couple of days later, maybe a week later, the woman for whom we had done this ritual got a packet of free information about home renovation delivered to her in the mail. And sort of the way people talked about this was that, okay, the goddess, so in this world there's a kind of the great goddess. The goddess didn't want her to have the house next door. She wanted her to pay attention to her own house and improve it. So that was sort of the idea. You'd have definitely something that seems like a mental technology, a use of the inner imagery. You're focusing again and again. You have an intention, some kind of direction, and you often have some kind of goal, something you're trying to achieve. Different groups have different goals. Again, some of them are very elite, very high. Some of them are very, very minor. There are different symbols. The witches are talking about the great goddess and the horned god. The kind of the Western mysteries, it's a little bit more It's a little bit. They all more or less use this. There's a little bit more Egypt in the Western mysteries.
So I'm curious about what all of this did for you. I mean, what was this experience like for you? And did you have any, I guess what I would call magical experiences that just you could not have predicted otherwise?
Yeah. I mean, so this is what set me off on this rabbit I've been chasing for the last few decades. So I come into this world, young anthropologist in graduate school. I have the idea that I'm going to write something about narratives. And that this, you go to the group, you learn the narratives, you learn the stories, and then you change your interpretations, all very cognitive. And what I learned was that, in fact, you do these practices and you have experiences. I felt magical power moving through me. I could actually feel it. It felt like an electrical force. I had a vision once of the horned god, and it was in my mind, but it kind of felt like it was in the world. About 8 months into this, I woke up. I was reading a book called The Mists of Avalon, which is a witchy book. It's written by a witch. It's Marion Zimmer Bradley, you used to be able to get it in the airport, but a vivid account of kind of a retelling of the Arthurian legend with magic and kind of the goddess thrown in. Anyways, I was reading that book, and I was really trying to read it the way that this community wanted me to read it, which is to read it as if it's happening, not to ask about the protagonist and my ideas about the author, but to have the story of Morgaine and Arthur come alive, as if I were there. And while reading this book, I woke up one morning and I saw 6 druids standing by the window. I mean, I leapt. The experience was that it was real. I marked it in my mind.
And you were not dreaming at this point. I mean, this was something else.
So, I mean, what's going on psychologically? So these experiences, they're called hypnopompic or hypnagogic experiences. When you are coming out of sleep, your experience is that you are not asleep. Your experience is that you are fully alert. Probably there is a story in which sleep and awareness are intermingled, but the perceptual experience was that I saw the druids and I felt that they were real. And then I kind of got out of bed. I mean, I sort of leapt forward and they vanished. And in fact, I was in a dream group. This is what you do in this kind of world. And I wrote this down in my dream diary in capital letters. I really saw this. And I went back to sleep and sort of forgot about it until the middle of the afternoon. And it was like, oh my goodness, something really important happened. And but those sorts of, I had experiences like that. And that was why I began to study those experiences. I wasn't unique. I mean, this is what happened to people in this kind of world.
So I want to ask you about your approach to studying religion or spiritual experience. I mean, obviously your approach is you go in and you do it. I mean, you join the groups that you're studying, you practice what they do, which strikes me as rather different than how most scholars study religion. And I guess I'm curious about what your take is on the way that cognitive scientists study religion or psychologists. It seems like your approach is rather different, and maybe you have some qualms about how religion is often studied.
I think there are many methods to many ends. I am struck by the fact that if you want to, I mean, these experiences really matter to people. I mean, they change people's lives. I mean, sometimes they don't. Sometimes people have these experiences and they walk off and it's like that. It's interesting. But they are often very powerful and very meaningful. And I thought that as I was in these worlds, that they were patterned. There were certain kinds of experiences. I thought there was probably a story to tell about what experiences were more common than others. I thought there was probably a story to tell about the way that specific practices made some experiences more likely to occur. I thought that some of my scholarly peers thought about religion as a matter of belief. And belief matters. But it is certainly not all that is all that matters. And a belief is a proposition, a statement you commit to. Experiences are rich. I found the experiences to be rich, complicated, motivational. I was struck that they changed my own sense of my mind. So when I was, we anthropologists, we really go native. So most people are not members of 5 different magical groups at any one time, just for the record. And I was being trained by all of them, and I was reading all these books, and I was taking all these field notes, and my experience of the world changed. Everything was drenched in symbolism and meaning, and there were no coincidences anymore, and I felt really alive, and I thought that was interesting. But being an anthropologist and being me, and being the fact that I was raised in a Unitarian church, and somehow it was it's part of who I am to think people have experiences and you don't know necessarily what they mean. And so it was just part of who I am to have an amazing experience and write down in my notebook, gee. So I'll tell you a story. Do you mind if I tell you a story?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
So so this is pretty early on in my magical experience. People would say, if you do magic, if you have magic going through you, you cannot wear a watch. You will break your watch. And so, okay, I write that down in my notebook. So I'm in London, I buy a watch. Costs about £3. I buy it in one of these, there's cardboard box at the side of the road. I need a watch, I have a watch. And I go for a run. And it's raining. It's a plastic watch. And as I'm running, I have this vivid mental recreation of a ritual event I went to. And I visually represent in my mind's eye the quality of power that the leader of the group, the adept, had spoken about. And I felt this power. I felt really alive. I was running around this park. And my watch stopped. And it broke. And I ran back home, and I wrote down 2 things. I said, wow, maybe this stuff works, and maybe this is why people think that this stuff works. And so that's what I do. I think so I try to...
But where does this leave you with trying to understand what religious experience is? Is it that people immerse themselves into this world of sometimes odd practices, sometimes very common practices, and then you end up believing it? And I mean, with your scholarly hat on, how do you make sense of religious experience, religion more generally?
So I am someone, for whatever reasons, I have not felt that I had to settle on the question of whether God is real, or even settle. So it's William James, who is sort of a man, a writer I much admire. I mean, William James comes to the end of the varieties of religious experience. It's a very long book, and he has explored many, many different experiences he has. And he says, I think there's more. I think that all of this stuff, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, those are overbeliefs. Those are concepts people put around whatever the more is. And he says, I don't know what the more is. And I guess I mean, there's certainly more than we're aware of. I mean, just almost by nature of the experience of consciousness. I mean, science knows, we know scientifically very little about the way consciousness works, what we are conscious of. I'm completely comfortable with the idea that there is more than we understand scientifically. And I'm sort of comfortable leaving it there. I mean, I should say...
And do you leave the question of does God exist? Do you leave that off the table just because we can't answer that? It's beyond science? Or why don't you go there?
It's going to sound very silly, but it's never really bugged me. I mean, I find it fascinating how God emerges for people. I'm fascinated by I think there's a human-God relationship with a small g. I think that God is different for different people, even for people within the same church community. God is different for different members of that community. That's actually one of the things that I was most moved by when I was studying evangelical Christians, because it's easy to have a stereotype that evangelical Christians all believe in the same God. But that's not what I experienced. That's not what I found. People have attached a whole range of cognitive meanings to that word that they're using. So I think what I'm good at doing is looking at the human side of the human-God relationship. I don't feel that it's part of my skill set to give an answer to the question of whether God is real. The other thing that's really important is that in any faith community, no matter how deeply shared the beliefs, ideas, symbols, culture is within that community, there's a lot of disagreement about whether God showed up in any particular case. Right? I mean, you have people will say, in an evangelical community, people will say, God spoke to me. There's a lot of disagreement within that church about whether that person is correct. I once heard a pastor say, if God speaks to you and God says, relax, it's going to be okay, I have no worry about you treating that as God. If God speaks to you and says, this was a New York pastor, if God speaks to you and says, quit your job and move out to Los Angeles, I want you to be praying with me and with your house group, your Bible study group. And there's a lot of,
some corroboration you want there. You want to check in with people who maybe are more knowledgeable about this than you are.
Well, I mean, I think that any time a group of people is committed to the idea that the more or God speaks, they're also pretty committed to the idea that there's a lot of human stuff that intervenes between the human asking the question and the whatever it is, the mind, the spirit that's responding.
So I want to ask you about your study with evangelical Christians. It was a charismatic church. Mm-hmm. And you were trying to understand this whole business of what does it mean to experience God? What does it mean to talk to God? What does it mean when people say God talks back? Right. What did you start to understand about what they meant by this encounter with God?
Well, the striking thing, so I started doing this because I was doing another project, and I ran into this woman in Southern California with like a Beach Boys, blonde hair, faithful evangelical Christian who said to me, if you want to understand my God, you should have coffee with God. We should have a cup of coffee with him. So that was pretty interesting to me. And I located a church in which I could be a deeply immersed anthropologist, and they were happy to have me there. And I'm not foreclosing the possibility that God is present. And so what did I learn? I went to church for years, and I started listening to what people said, and then I started doing experimental work. The first thing I saw was that the way people talked about learning to know God was sort of the same way the magicians talked about getting magic. They did the same kinds of practices. They did this. When people prayed, they shut their eyes, and they used all of their inner senses to experience whatever they were praying about as being vividly present. Like my magicians, they were clear that their inner world became more vivid. So one woman said to me, "It's like PowerPoint now in my mind. My inner world has become more alive." They talked about the world being more interconnected. There being nothing happened by chance. There was a sense that that the world worked together for them. They did something. I began to notice that they did something different that I hadn't named with the magicians, but was true, which is that, and I'm really only starting to understand it now, people did two kinds of techniques. They used all of their inner senses. They also did what I'll call an as-if presence. So you are not only, people will sit in Jesus's lap, they'll go for a walk with Jesus, they'll stand in the throne room, they'll try to feel the heat from his power on their cheeks. But they're also imagining a conversation, a bit like an imaginary friend. They don't think that God is imaginary, but they do know that if you're going to represent a God, you've got to use your imagination because you can't see God, so you've got to use your inner senses.
So are they kind of having conversations with God? They ask God questions and God answers?
Yeah. I mean, it's as with magicians and as with many other faiths, there's a pretty broad array of things that count as God's response. So there's the big stuff, the big, a vision, a voice, an intense sense of presence, an out-of-body experience, a mystical experience. So that's the big stuff. The little stuff is a circumstance that doesn't feel circumstantial. You went for a walk, you ran into somebody, she said something very important that you needed to hear. There is the kind of, you have a feeling that there's something that you must do, and you do it, and it's the right thing to do. You can also have a thought in your mind that doesn't really feel like yours. And I became really interested in this category of experiences. You can be reading the Bible and a verse jumps out at you. You feel different when you read this verse, and you feel that this is God's answer to you. I became most fascinated in those interior experiences that sometimes weren't entirely interior. So people would say, well, God said yes. God said tithe. God said go up to her and offer to pray for her. Or God said go to Kansas. Go see your parents. It's, God. And so people report these words. So what I became really interested in this. So there's a general story that people get better at this. And I've now shown this with other methods, more objective methods. People get better at this stuff. Their inner world becomes more vivid. They seem to have more experiences that somehow pop out of their mind, for want of a better term, that feel real.
They practice at it. I mean,
they practice.
And I assume that's through prayer, for instance. In other words, if the more you do it, the better you become at it. And for instance, you can become better at prayer. I mean, it sort of reminds me of that idea that, do your 10,000 hours of practice and you'll become great at whatever it is. It sounds like you're saying that's true with praying, for instance, with experiencing God.
Yes. I'm not sold that it's 10,000 hours, but it's some hours. So it used to be, okay. So after I'd been doing this for quite a while, I encountered people who invented invisible friends with no metaphysical commitments. So I don't know if you've heard of these people. These are tulpomancers. Does this mean anything? No. Okay. This is a little corner of the internet that enables people to come together. So this is a group of people who sort of imagine they're doing this ancient Tibetan spiritual practice. But it's not. It is and is not like deity yoga. But they usually start. They tend to be more or less men, more or less in their 20s and 30s, definitely with time on their hands. And they come across this site that tells you that you can make an invisible friend. And you don't have to believe anything. And there are two techniques. One technique is visualization. So one of the first tulpamancers I met wanted a friend who was a fox. And he had the idea that it needed to be 10,000 hours. And so the early phase of these folks, this started around 2012. They found me because I wrote this book on God and evangelical Christianity. And one of the tulpamancers actually posted a review of the book on a tulpamancer site, said, "This is a great guide to tulpamancy, just ignore all that God stuff." And so what they do is that this young man who wanted to create a fox, he shut his eyes, vividly visualized the fox, tried to also feel the feel of the fox's fur, tried to see the outline of the fox's ears, tried to look at the nose, and it did that vividly, and he thought he had to do it for 10,000 hours. And probably a little earlier than that, he began, so this is the striking thing. The fox begins to feel autonomous, just as God begins to feel more present, and just as the magic seems to feel more real. So the fox became something that was not a fox. And the fox began to talk. And in fact, so I've now talked pretty systematically with a young colleague, to about 25 people. We flew them in from around the country, and so they showed up at Stanford, and we talked to them for 4 hours, and we actually were trying to see whether the voice of their tuple would show up in an fMRI machine. But in any event, so
Wait, did it?
I think so. It only really shows up. You've got a lot of activity to show up in a magnet, and it's a really noisy thing to be in a magnet. And but yeah, I think that so if you imagine that you're writing a letter, if you're asked a question and you write the answer. Then if you're asked a question, you imagine your mom is directing your hand and you write an answer. Those look the same. But if you ask your tulpa to answer the question for you using your hand, your brain looks a little different. So it's not published. We're still trying to analyze it. But there's something that's really going on. So again, I think that's what's really interesting, is that these experiences are real and powerful. They're not a way of talking. They're changing your experience.
So what did that change for you, if it did change anything for you? Because, I mean, you said you spent a couple of years with this church, this charismatic church, and you prayed. I know you joined the prayer group. So did you encounter God yourself, or did you feel that?
Yeah. I mean, I go to church. I decided that, actually it was I sort of go to church because I was reading Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, and I decided that Cranmer was up to something. And I decided that I wanted to encounter the words of the Book of Common Prayer, that somehow these had been words that had been spoken for many centuries, that they calmed me and comforted me, and I didn't quite know what I made of the being to which they were addressed, but I found it calming. So I have enjoyed the experience of going to church.
And what does going to church do for you now?
I have no idea. But I mean, that was a flippant answer. I like the experience of reminding myself that the world as it is, may not be the world that we are stuck with. And so that there are many ways to remind yourself of that, but to use language that has been used for hundreds of years, in which you feel a commitment to justice and peace, I find that calming. I'm not sure what it means. Sometimes I sit in the pew and I try to figure out why I'm there. But I really like it. I really like the encounter with this text.
So one of the things that you've been talking about is having this capacity, developing this capacity to put yourself in the place of these traditions that you've been studying. It's an act of imagination, basically.
Yes.
And I know there's a literature about this. I mean, C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian writer, in his book Mere Christianity, he had a chapter called "Let's Pretend." What did he mean? What does it mean to pretend to kind of make it real, I guess?
Let us pretend in order to believe, to experience it as real. So again, you have this problem of the everyday world, which is not always just, not always kind, not always well ordered. And Lewis, everybody has their own understanding of theology. Everybody has their own understanding of what God means. And Lewis felt that, of course, it was ridiculous to pray to God as if you were a child of God. I mean, what a hubristic kind of claim. And he said that, you really have to pretend that that's true in order to allow yourself to experience it as true. And one of the things I noticed when I was spending time with evangelical Christians, and I found this very moving, is that I would sit with people and talk, and often in these longer interviews, there would come a point where somebody would cry. And they would usually cry when they talked about the moment when they really got it, when the penny dropped, when they got that God loved them. And that was striking to me because, they're spending an awful lot of their time uttering sentences about believing in God and God loving them. And so what they seemed to be saying, it was that there are these, most people, even, now we're getting back to belief. So belief is this commitment. I can show this psychologically. Most people don't treat their religious belief commitments as being as trustworthy as many everyday commitments. So you have a commitment, for example, that there's, this floor is going to be stable throughout the course of this talk. A hole will not suddenly open in the middle of the floor. That's a belief. That's a kind of dull belief that's so basic that you don't even realize it. Most people, when they talk about God, they tell you that God can do anything, but they don't ask God to write their term paper or to feed their dog. They treat God as somehow different. And in treating God as different, many, many people of faith, they want somehow to, they say that God can do everything, but they don't really behave as if God can do everything, and they want to believe more. It's one of the most robust things that people of faith say, that they wish they could believe it were true, even if they're telling you that it's true. And so there's sort of, there are these moments when that kind of true but not quite true commitment feels as if it is as real as tables and chairs, as real as their knowledge that the floor is not going to open and they fall through. And that is so rare that it makes people cry. And it's amazing to them. And often afterwards, they say, well, it goes. You get it. And then it goes. And then they try to get it back.
But it also sounds like what you're saying is we have this capacity, in some sort of collective sense, maybe I'm talking about sort of people with a spiritual bent, to kind of compartmentalize. I mean, there's our daily life. We fully operate in the world, the physical world, believing in science and rationality and all of that. We don't really think that God is going to intervene in our lives. And then there's this other world that we kind of, or some people do think that, and they sort of coexist, even though they don't really seem to be reconcilable, if you think about it logically.
That's the challenge of what it is to be human. So when I was writing about this most recently, I talked about the everyday frame and the faith frame. And the faith frame is where you are when you take God seriously, and your everyday world. Often that's less salient. And so often the work of faith is trying to pull this abstract idea closer to you, which is why spiritual experience matters so much. when people have no matter how much, like the Christians that I knew, no matter how believing they were, I always had the sense that they didn't really believe that the message that they heard from the pulpit was really directed at them, that God really loved them the way that they were told that God would love them. And so those moments when somebody has an experience that seems as if they are hearing God speak, an experience that breaks their perceptual expectations, or they have a sense of presence that's so vivid they know exactly where God is sitting, that can really make a big difference.
So you have this concept, I don't know if you came up with the idea yourself, of what you call porosity, that the membrane between our minds, what we think, and the outer world, it gets very thin. And sort of the more porous it is, the more likely we are to have spiritual experience.
So the way I think about it is that, first of all, the Cartesian model of mind, not a good description of how you experience your mental space. So more or less we think of the mind as the thoughts as being stuff we generate that stays in our body, that nobody else can see, doesn't really do stuff. I mean, it affects us, but it doesn't leak into the world and do stuff. Except that all of you have had powerful intuitions that thoughts have come to you from the outside, or you've had the intuition that thought feels like power that can do something in the world, or somebody else's thought feels like a power that can enter you, or that people who really love each other, one of them can know what the other is thinking if they really need to. So we have these intuitions. So people, different cultures, develop the idea that the mind-world relationship is porous in particular ways. So if you believe in prayer, you believe that your thought can somehow affect the world, and a big spirit picks it up in some ways and does something with it. If you ever worry that somebody is cursing you, or you're so angry you want to curse somebody else, and you have a feeling, even if you don't believe it, that it's going to work, that's a porous idea. It feels as if your mind can somehow go out. Or if you have the idea that somehow, like all of us probably think it's intuitively possible that minds can survive the absence of the body. We call that a soul. We have, at the moment of death, something remains. So you can ask people about their cultural beliefs, their ideas about whether, if you pray really hard, you can win the lottery, or if you. So I did this project with many other people, in which we were interested in the relationship between the way people thought about their minds, their thoughts, and how they experienced spirit. And we were in 5 countries.
What were the 5 countries?
United States, Ghana, Thailand, China, I want to say Shanghai, and a rural area, and Vanuatu. And we had these rich conversations with faithful people, and half of the faithful people we talked to were charismatic Christians, and half of them were not. They were whatever, the local important faith. And we had people go to the equivalent of the DMV and interview people. And we took questionnaires to undergraduate dorms and had them fill out. And there were 2 really striking things we found out. And we were really careful to think about how we were asking the question and how we were looking at the answer. The more porous commitments people said they believed in. It's like another way we asked this was we sat with people and we said, so imagine that there are 2 neighbors, Mary and Martha. And one day Martha realizes that Mary is really, really angry at her. Do you think that Mary can hurt Martha? No, Mary's the angry one, right? Sometimes I get this. Okay, there's the angry one and the one who's vulnerable. We ask people, do you think that Mary could ever really hurt Martha? Supposing Mary was a certain kind of person, supposing she's thought certain kinds of words, could that ever happen? Anyway, so the more, no matter what method we use, no matter where we go, the more porous commitments, the more people say that they have experienced God vividly, the more they have heard God, the more they've had spiritual experiences like hearing God speak or seeing an angel or feeling a sense of presence or having one of these truly remarkable experiences like an out-of-body experience. And we've replicated that now in a group of 1,800 people through a kind of one of these internet search services called Prolific. So that's one thing. So the more porosity, the more spiritual experience. The other thing that's really true, and it turns out that porosity is not the same as religious commitment. It's its own kind of set of ideas about the mind. And you cannot be religious and still have porous commitments about the mind. The other thing that's pretty consistent is that people who are higher in absorption are more likely to have these experiences. So remember my magicians who said some people are better at this than others? Well, the evangelicals said that too. They said that some people are just better at praying than other people. And so one of the things that we see is that, so what's absorption? Bluntly, it's a list of 34 questions. You say true or false, this applies to me. So this is devised by this guy, Auke Tellegen. It was initially a pen and paper measure of hypnotizability. It's not that. It's related to that, but it's not that. There are questions like, sometimes I feel and experience the world the way I did as a child. Or sometimes when I'm watching a play or a movie, I forget that it's just a play or a movie. It feels real. Or I can turn noise into music by the way that I listen to it. Like 34 of these questions. So the more truths somebody gives, the more vivid, perceptual-like experiences of spirit they report.
It sounds kind of like suspending your critical judgment. I mean, that's kind of what absorption is.
Yes, they're probably. So I worked with a young psychological collaborator, Kara Weissman, and so she's been looking at the way people answer these questions, and we think that there are really two underlying factors. They're not. You can't pull. The scale hangs together remarkably well. I mean, this gets into a language that's probably too intricate for the occasion. But it looks like there are two underlying things going on. First, people who give a lot of truths like vivid imagery. They probably have vivid imagery and they like vivid imagery. The other is that they probably are able to suspend disbelief or have more epistemic flexibility or have more, they're able to not discount. Who knows?
So where do atheists and skeptics fit into all of this? Because my gut feeling would be that there's not a whole lot of porosity there. I mean, they kind of have these clear dividing lines between, what is happening in their head and, sort of how they think about the outside world, and maybe less absorption too, less willing to sort of go with these intuitions that something kind of weird is going on.
So I can answer that question based on our data, and Kara Weissman is leading this paper. But what we saw, I told you we ran a study recently with 1,800 people, and in that group there's a good chunk of atheists and a good chunk of spiritual but not religious folks and a good chunk of other people. So it is true that atheists on average report less absorption, so their score is a little lower. And on average, they report fewer porous commitments. And on average, they have fewer spiritual experiences. And the spiritual but not religious are way up there.
So my interpretation of that would be something kind of weird happens. I mean, you get the phone call. You've just been thinking about someone you haven't thought about for a year, and suddenly you get the phone call. The spiritual person's going to think, oh, there's some sort of connection there, telepathic connection. The atheist is just going to dismiss that, just coincidence. I mean, that it's sort of that kind of. It's like whether you take it seriously or not.
Well, that's a non-trivial question. So you have kind of, let's call them ordinary experiences. You've got a coincidental phone call, or maybe you have kind of a thought in your mind and it feels like it's a thought from your dead brother or from God or whatever. You get these ordinary experiences that you need to learn. You come into one of these settings, you need to learn to interpret. And what I see is that as people become part of these groups, as they immerse themselves in manuals, or spirit mediums are another kind of domain in which you see change happen. So in the evangelicals, these ordinary experiences, they're taking advantage of some features of thought, like some thoughts really do feel like they pop, like they're stronger or louder, or they're more spontaneous. So they're beginning to interpret these experiences, and those experiences become more marked, bigger for them. There are other experiences that seem more spontaneous, like you can't train for them. Voices, visions, smell of God, taste of God, presence, weird stuff, dramatic stuff. We know, and so we're just working on a paper now in which another one of these huge studies, both this prolific study and the original Mind and Spirit 5-country study. We also see that the minutes per day that you pray, you report more experiences. So what you're training is paying attention to your mind. What you're generating or what you're facilitating are a whole bunch of experiences. They're not so common, but they don't all seem like the same thing. Like the sense that God is right there, I know exactly where he is. That seems like a different thing in the mind and the body than falling asleep and hearing God call your name.
So can I just pursue this idea of hearing voices? So you want to just
listen. Let me just finish that.
Sure.
So the deep question you've asked is: Does practice change the frequency of these experiences because of the way that you're paying attention? And the short answer is yes, but it's not clear whether people are allowing things to flower into existence, or whether there are different kinds of people who have voice-like experiences or present-like experiences or out-of-body experiences. There is so much we don't know, but there's clearly an underlying architecture to spiritual experience. And there's some general things we can claim, but there are differences between people.
So coming back to this question of, imagining, and you're sort of calling into being, in a sense, these experiences that you've been training for. Is it just delusional? I mean, how do you separate you hear a voice, for instance. How do you know whether that's a real voice or whether it's just delusional and you're having maybe a psychotic episode?
Again, not my question, or at least I don't answer the question of whether God ever really speaks. But I do have a lot to say about the experiences of psychosis or madness and the experiences of religion. I think it is, and I want to start with an argument I don't agree with. That argument would say all of these dramatic experiences, they're caused by a deficit. Whatever deficit is going on in psychosis and schizophrenia, not that we know, and there may be more than one, and maybe there's so much. Anyway, whatever is going on in schizophrenia and psychosis, there are at least many people who do not have that going on, as far as we can tell, and who have spiritual experiences. I think there's at least one other pathway. I think sleep is a third pathway. And and we don't. There are people. Different people have theories about what may be causing this, but for sure, because of my conversations with people, because of my immersion, because of my interviews, and because of our experimental work finding a relationship between absorption and spiritual experience and porosity and spiritual experience, I think you can make a claim with some confidence that many spiritual experiences are not the result of incipient psychosis. There's something else going on.
Right. But on the other hand, I mean, there are these, famous stories in the history of mystical literature, Christian mystics, St. Francis of Assisi, Teresa of Avila, who heard voices.
Of course.
So the question is, were those religious experiences? Were those psychotic experiences? Can you parse
They can
that?
be both. I mean, one of the things that the Bible gives us a pretty good example of somebody who seems to meet criteria for schizophrenia. I'm not diagnosing at a distance. I'm just telling you that the narrator seems to Ezekiel seems to display some characteristics that make him look as if he could have been psychotic. I'm not making a claim about whether he existed or what the narrator intended, but Ezekiel seems to you could claim he hears commands a lot. They're pretty weird commands. They are. He seems to hear people talking, and they're not present. You can at least advance an argument, and some people have done this. The Bible would tell you that God can use, if there is a God, God can use many vehicles to prophesy his word. So that's not the deep question. The deep question is, well, I think what we can say with confidence that not everybody who hears voices is psychotic. So first of all, there's a lot that goes into the word voice. These are these experiences that feel as if they are not me. So you talk to people who've heard a voice. They've been called by someone. They feel they have heard God say out loud, "That's not the one." Maybe they've been up for a job. And God says, "That's not the one." So people say about these experiences, "It doesn't feel like me. I really didn't have my voice timbre." Often they say, I don't know where, they say something odd about where it's located. Sometimes they say, "I heard it audibly in my mind," or "I heard it in the world, but not with my ears." There's something a little odd. The voice always has an intention. It doesn't feel like listening to music. It is a mind that is communicating with purpose. Some of these experiences are fully audible. Some of them are not. So we know that these are not so uncommon in the broader community. They are not always associated with psychosis. At least I would advance that argument strongly. It can be hard to tell whether somebody who hears a voice is or is not psychotic. That's a different question. I can tell you on average, there are a lot of people who have, in general, if somebody is psychotic and it's obvious that this person is ill, they hear a lot of voices, those voices go on for a long time, and they're pretty mean. Evangelicals, magicians, whatever. When people who are not obviously mad hear voices, typically the voice is rare. They can remember a handful of auditory experiences at best. Typically the voice is no more than 4 to 6 words, and typically the voice is kind. The voice is doing something useful. There are a lot of Joan of Arcs, and we don't. Oliver Sacks wants to say that Joan of Arc had epilepsy. He makes a good case. I'm not sure. I was called up by a Joan of Arc who happened to be a guy who gave the same story of a force that was compressing from the outside. Joan's story also shifts over the course of her conversation with her inquisitors. It's not entirely clear. One of the things I do want to say is that of the people who have frequent voice hearing experiences within a religious framework, I think some of them might have incipient psychosis, which the religion has helped to rein in. So I want to make it very clear that I think, for example, there are two groups of people I've been talking with, trying to understand recently. One is spirit mediums. There's a group in England, or different spirit mediums in England. So these are people who talk to the dead, and they come and get training, and then they sometimes perform. They perform in spiritualist churches. They, sometimes they perform in a big hall. They have a big audience, and they say, I'm getting a woman, I think she's in her late 50s, very elegant, does this mean anything? And then they try to get somebody, try to figure out whose spirit this is. The other group is a group of people in Ghana called a Komfu, or practitioners of the traditional religion, who talk with the gods. And it's a kind of practice that's not unlike Voodoo, Candomblé, Bahia. So I and others, we systematically interviewed two groups of these folks, the Komfu and the spirit mediums. I think we see at least two groups of people. So everybody says, God talks to me. The dead talk to me. But when you really sit with people and you really try to say, what's it sound like? And how often? Does it ever mean? There are at least two groups of people, and it's very hard to feel confident about, there's a line here, a line here. And I think there's more than two groups. But there's some people who really talk as if they have something like a psychotic break that went pretty badly. And they found this group and they got trained. And the training helped them to control their voice hearing experience and made the voices kinder. And they haven't had to go to the hospital. And there are other people who are they just thought it was a cool thing to be a spirit medium. And they buy the book and they decide to go to the hall, or maybe their parents chucked them into a Komfu training. And when they talk to me about their experiences, it's not so negative. It's completely under their control. It's a lot less audible. It's sometimes audible. And so I think there are different, kinds of capacities and vulnerabilities that religious practice sometimes helps people to manage.
Tanya, I have more questions, but we're running short of time, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions from our audience here. So we have a couple of mics, I believe. So if you do have a question, yes, so we have some people who will hand the mic out, but raise your hand, and we'll have a little time to talk with you.
I haven't systematically set out to study people who were inspired. I'm sort of tempted to study musicians. And so I've got a postdoc who really wants to do that. And jazz musicians are famous for hearing the music come from the outside. So what I can say is that the training has consequences, but a lot of things happen without training. So William James said that, sometimes when something feels spontaneous, you've really been searching for it and you haven't recognized it, and so it just happens. There might be some of that. But I do think that I see three factors that influence these experiences. They influence it a little bit. There's a lot more that's going on. I'm not ruling out the idea of a spirit talking as well. So absorption, practice, porosity. Those all have an influence. People also report things happening out of the blue. People have mystical experiences out of the blue. Sometimes it really sticks with them, changes their life. Sometimes it makes not a difference in the world. It's anyway. It's complicated. We're complicated creatures. So I would say that right now, the evidence can support many different kinds of interpretations. It can support a complicated mind in which we are unaware of the things so much that we know that we don't know that we know. It can support an atheist position, in other words. It can support a Christian position. It can support an Islamic position. I mean, there are many that it can support the idea that somehow we are all interconnected with sort of electrical impulses. There are many different theories that you can have about why people have vivid experiences, why near-death experiences seem so powerful for people, why they happen. I think we'll learn more as science progresses. I think we'll learn much more. I don't think we have a settled theory of why people hear voices when they're psychotic, for example. I mean, that's a pretty particular, there's a lot of money poured into that question, and there's still a lot of disagreement. So I don't think we certainly haven't solved the question, problem of spirituality.
Do you think science can or will at some point be able to explain big ecstatic religious experiences or transcendent experiences?
Well, I think those are pretty complicated experiences. I think that the idea that our molecular structures are interacting teaches us more than we knew before, gives people more theories about how to make sense of things spiritual. I don't know. I don't know. So again, you can get the experience of God out of the experience of your own mind. So if we experience our thoughts as sometimes not our own, sometimes not coming from inside, and having intention and purpose, you can ask the question, do we believe in gods and spirits because some humans hear voices? It's a perfectly reasonable argument. And you can make the argument, you can make an atheistic argument that around the world, because humans have the capacity to hear voices and feel presence. We don't understand exactly the bodily details, but we do know that happens. Maybe the idea of gods and spirits is universal because people have these experiences. You can also make the very good argument that spirits are universal and people hear them. I think there's always something to say about the human side of that story. But you were correct. It is the case that we have not yet found a community that does not hold the idea of some kind of spirit.
On that note of ambiguity, I think that is an excellent place to leave it. Thank you so much.